The Traveller's League Book 1 The Timepiece, written by Nick Goss. Animas. Hoops was relieved that the ground wasn't shaking anymore. It was also nice to see some daylight again. He was in a forest of pine trees on the side of a big hill that stretched from a wild rushing river below up to a cliff face high above him. A distant growly grumble came from a big brown bear down at the water's edge. Hoops recognised the shape of its head and humped shoulders. It was a grizzly. The bear stood on its hind legs and looked up the hill towards Hoops. It was sniffing the air and caught the scent of the traveller. With a roar, the grizzly charged up the bank. Hoops had heard he was supposed to play dead if a bear ever attacked him, so he curled up in a ball and covered himself completely with his mossy grassy cloak that Wally Tom had given him. The thud of the bear's paws and the snapping of twigs and pine needles grew louder and louder, but the bear charged right past him. It stopped a short distance past Hoops, stood and sniffed the air again. Hoops could see through the fibres of the cloak quite easily and knew that the bear must have lost sight of him. But bears could smell another animal more than a mile away, so Hoops just lay completely still. He held his breath too. He wouldn't make a move or a sound. The irritable bear turned towards him and stopped only inches away. Hoops could see the vicious, enormous black claws and the giant's great nose sniffing the ground surrounding the cloak, but the bear didn't attack Hoops. After a few minutes of snorting and sniffing, the grumpy bear moaned and plodded back down to the water's edge. Hoops was completely invisible to the bear under the cloak, and the bear hadn't been able to see or smell him. Phew! He let out a heavy sigh, grateful that Wally Tom had given him such a fine gift. He stood slowly and silently so as not to alarm the bear. He donned the cloak and made sure that he covered his head with the hood. While he walked, birds would swoosh by his head, chirping and calling, and the squirrels, nature's most nervous critter, would continue digging for fallen nuts in the soft dirt without a clue or care that a big human boy was about to step on them. It became obvious to Hoops that while he wore the cloak's hood, the animals of the forest could neither see nor hear him. Just for fun, he stepped in front of a bobcat crouched just outside a rabbit's hole. It prepared to pounce as soon as the unlucky bunny had the bad sense to emerge from the hovel. Hoops estimated the distance between his toes and the crouched predator was only about 3 feet. He raised his hands up to his head, grabbed the hood of his cloak and flicked it back. The bobcat's whole body jolted as if it had just brushed an electric fence, and it jumped straight up in the air in surprise. Its feet dangled in the air and trailed behind it as it lifted off. It must have flown 10 feet straight up like a cheap firework, then come back down in the same spot. When it hit the ground, it made quite an ungraceful scramble to get on its feet and run off into the woods. Hoop's sides ached from laughing so hard. Off to find the phoenix, Hoops took inventory of what little he knew of the mythical bird. 1, he told himself aloud as he extended his forefinger. The bird can live for hundreds of years. 2, he extended his second finger. The bird creates a nest before it dies, and when it's time it bursts into flames. Extending a third finger, he continued. 3, a new phoenix is born from the pile of the dead phoenix's ashes. He guessed that if he needed a phoenix feather, he had to find the nest and either snatch a feather from the bird just before it burned, or pluck a feather from the young bird as soon as it was born. Either way, he continued aloud, I have to find the nest. My guess is that it will be someplace high and out of reach of any predators. He turned towards the cliff face that began at the top of the slope on his left. The cliff shot straight up 100 feet, then plateaued in a flat mountain top. I bet I can get a good look at the whole area from up there. Slipping the hood back over his head, he scrambled up the hill and reached the foot of the cliff. He hadn't really climbed much as a kid, other than the occasional playground equipment and a plastic climbing wall inside a sporting goods store. He knew it was important not to look down and remembered someone telling him he needed complete focus on just finding the next foothold or handhold. Step by step he found his way, slowly crawling up the face of the cliff. He never tried to guess if he was halfway up or how far down the ground might be. He didn't think of anything except where he'd place his hand or foot next. His mind burned with focus, and he felt a strange sense of peace and freedom as he tackled his climb. At last, he reached the top. As Hoops pulled his shoulder over the ledge, he needed to grab a rock or vine or root that would help him pull the rest of his body up and he could finally rest. But there was nothing but sand and pebbles at the cliff's edge. The muscles in his arms and legs burned from exhaustion. He knew he didn't have a lot of energy left, and if he didn't figure out something quickly, he would panic. He slipped his hand down to his new dagger and threw it out. He raised his arm and plunged the dagger into the dirt in front of him. He imagined the blue steel stabbing into Braxo's heart, which just made him stab harder. With the knife deeply in the ground, it made the perfect anchor, and Hoops used his remaining strength to pull his entire body off the cliff wall and onto the flat dirt. All he could do was roll over onto his back and breathe. Relief flooded his limbs, and as the cool, dry wind and the warm sun cast their spell on him, he fell asleep. His dreams were very strange. He slid along the ground on his belly. He could feel the sand and rocks scraping by, and he could slip through the tiniest spaces between rocks and shrubs. He was a snake. His long, powerful body would twist and squeeze and wind its way forward with ease. He flicked his tongue out, and a rush of sensation filled his mouth. He felt the heat of a very large animal near him. He couldn't see the world around him that well, but he could feel its heat, and that was just as good. He slithered towards the animal and slid over its leather boots. The creature lay flat on the ground. Sliding up the leg, he coiled himself on the creature's chest. It was soft and warm, covered with an animal skin shirt. The creature had one arm extended with its hands holding a bone-handled blue knife. It was Hoops' sleeping body. He decided to get a different point of view and slid off the chest, winded his way to a nearby rock and coiled himself up facing the boy's sleeping body. As he took in the sight and the heat through his snaky tongue, he realized this wasn't a dream at all. This was Animas. He was inside the snake's mind. His sleeping boy body turned his head, then rolled over to get more comfortable. As it did, the dagger slipped out of his hand. Everything went black. Hoops was jolted awake, and he sat straight up. He lifted his hands and looked at them and felt himself all over. He was back in his own body, sitting up with his legs stretched straight out in front of him. He felt an icy fear on the back of his neck and turned his head to the left. There, on a rock only 5 or so feet from him, was the biggest rattlesnake he'd ever seen. Its diamond pattern was dark and beautiful, running the length of its entire body. The snake rattled, not appreciating having its mind hijacked. Hoops knew he was moments away from being bit, and that would mean certain death for a boy alone in the wilderness. His only defense was to pick up the knife and back away slowly. He slowly slid his hand forward along the ground and over the handle. When he picked up the blade, it vibrated in his hands. He pointed it at the snake and closed his eyes. A tingle in his stomach signaled something had changed. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at his own boy body standing upright with a knife pointed at him. he was in control of the snake again. Inside its mind and body, this is powerful magic. Wham! He was knocked off his rocky perch by something. Dazed from the impact, he couldn't make sense of what had just happened until he looked around for his boy body. He was down below him, getting smaller and smaller. He felt cold, black talons squeezing him, and then he flicked his tongue out. It was filled with a feathery scent and the heat of a large bird. It was an eagle, carrying him high up over the pine forests, the river, and all the rest of it. They rose high above the plateau and skimmed just above a cloud. Hoops saw in the distance a volcano poking its cratered head through the thick clouds miles and miles away. The phoenix must be there. But this eagle wasn't going to the volcano. It headed to its nest for dinner, and as soon as the eagle got Hoops to its nest, it would devour him. But he wouldn't be eaten without a fight. In fact, as a rattlesnake, he had some special tools he would love to share with this screechy bird. He locked his eyes on the eagle's leg, just above where the claw meets the thigh, flexed his muscles, and struck as hard as he could. But he could feel his fangs easily slip into the eagle's meaty leg, past feathers and all the way down to the bone. Once he had sunk his fangs into the eagle, he pumped venom through them. It was only a matter of time. The eagle weakened and became woozy, opening its talons to release the snake. But Hoops didn't let go. He held onto the bird with his fangs and dangled like the string of a kite. They descended lower and lower. Eventually, they were just over the plateau. The eagle's heart finally stopped midair, and it dropped straight down to the ground, landing in a poof of dust and feathers. Hoops landed on top of the bird and survived the fall with no harm done. He closed his eyes and summoned the feeling in his stomach again. Back in his own boy body, he lowered the knife and went over to look at the fallen eagle. What a beautiful creature it was, a majestic golden eagle. He remembered reading about this species. It was the most skilled winged hunter in the sky. He felt terrible for having killed this bird. But when he saw, in the snake's body, all he cared about was survival, and his instinct was to strike. Now, in his own body, he felt sadness and regret. Careful not to get too close to the snake, he gathered rocks and placed them all around and on top of the dead eagle, making a grave for the fallen raptor. The snake slithered its way to the top of the rocky pile and disrespectfully coiled itself up and rattled at Hoops. "Get off!" he screamed, but the snake just rattled, taunting him. "I hate you," he continued. "I wish you had fallen to your death." Hoops slipped his dagger out and stepped towards the rattlesnake. The rattle grew louder and louder, warning the boy to keep away. The rattle was a warning to Hoops, but also served as a dinner bell for more hungry eagles. Wham! Another golden eagle slammed into the snake from above. The snake twisted and struck, but the eagle had a claw just below its head, keeping the snake's fangs out of reach. Hoops watched as the eagle held the snake against the rocky dirt while it poked and ripped with its beak. Eventually, the snake stopped moving, dead. Free from danger, the eagle lifted into the air with its dinner dangling in its talons. This was a perfect opportunity, and Hoops wasted no time. Pointing the knife at the great bird, he sensed the vibration of the blade in his hand. When he closed his eyes, he felt the tingle in his stomach again.